Chapter 5. Reunion. I wonder how everyone is doing. 3 years have come and gone since that dreadful day. So much so that Ken found himself reflecting on the past with a mixture of emotions he had not felt in years. For the past 3 years, Ken hadn't thought about his friends and how worried they must be. Hadn't thought about his partner, Wormmon, nor his brother, Felismon, and how they were doing in the digital world. For the longest time, since his mother abandoned him to his fate, all that had invaded his mind was fear. Fear and anxiety. Fear that his father one day being released from prison to torment him, as he promised he would, and a fear of meeting his mother again after all this time, and having her reject him. Reopening wounds that had just, finally, begun to heal. Ken was beyond grateful that the Minamotos and his brother, Takumi, were so very patient with him. They had been with him every step of the way as he went through the constant roller coaster of anxiety, depression, flashbacks, and night terrors. Ken honestly felt guilty that they had been spending all their time on him instead of concentrating on themselves. But they were family. Family helped each other out through thick and thin. For the first time in years, Ken allowed himself to smile. Ken couldn't remember how many times he had been told those words as he was going through a panic attack, or when he woke up from an instant's nightmare. Ken knew he was in safe hands, but the fear had always come in the way. It was always those reasons why he had been too afraid to look at his D-terminal, or to answer his phone when his friends called. Ken sighed from his position on his bed as he rested his chin on his knees. Sure has been a long time since I've talked to the others. 3 years, to be exact. Ken turned his gaze to his nightstand, where several picture frames were proudly displayed. There were 5 pictures in total. One of them was group pictures of him and the others as they defeated Belial Vamdemon. Ken, along with Daisuke, Hikari, Takeru, Miyako, and Lori, were holding up their baby Digimon as they stood next to each other, while Taichi and his group stood behind them. Taichi had both of his arms wrapped around his and Daisuke's shoulders, while Yamoto stood calmly next to him. Sora and Mimi were behind Miyako, with both of their hands resting on Miyako's shoulders, and finally, Kushiro and Ju were standing behind Lori. They had all been smiling as Janai took their picture. That truly had been a wonderful day. Next to that picture was a photograph that Janai had given him on that day. That picture still brought him to tears as he remembered everything. All the memories that had been locked away. All the memories of the battles they have faced against Millenniumon. All the nights of closeness and semi-peace as they slept in a cave or in a secluded forest. Ryo. Ken smiled sadly at the old picture of him. Ryo, Vmon, and Wormmon. Janai had explained everything that day. Everything from the purpose of the Dark Seed, to what happened at the D-tournament, to why he had to become the Kaiser. Daisuke, Miyako, Lori, Hikari, and Takaru had been angered on his behalf, while Taichi and the others looked away in shame. They hadn't even realized that the little boy that had fought with Ryo, that had been his best friend and constant support, was him. They said he had looked familiar. They hadn't wanted to believe that the two were one and the same. They hadn't wanted to admit that they had allowed one of their own to be taken from them so easily, even though Taichi and Yamato had made a promise to Ryo that they would look after him before he left to face Millenniumon once and for all. They never did. He had no one to protect him when darkness called. He probably shouldn't have forgiven them so easily. He didn't blame them for anything, however. It may have been their fault that he had lost his one and only friend that day. It may have been their fault that they had failed to protect a fellow chosen. one of their own from the clutches of darkness, with him falling down the dark path that had been laid out for him. But instead of hating them and yelling at them for all the pain and suffering he had gone through, he forgave them. Because they were his friends. It might have resulted in him being the Kaiser, but they came to him in the end. They saved him from himself and returned him to the light. They made him see that he was not alone anymore, that he had others to rely on, that light, no matter how big or how small or how long it took, would always prevail over darkness. And in a way, they were right. Despite the suffering he had gone through after that day, despite being separated from his friends, from his Digimon, from his mother, despite the nightmares, the fear, and the abuse, he was finally him again. He wasn't completely healed. Ken doubted he would ever be. He would never be whole. But he was close, and that was good enough. Ken smiled once more as he released his arms from their tight grip around his knees. He shifted his gaze to the last 3 photos. One was of Stingmon and Felismon. The second was of Osamu, and the last was of his friend and neighbor, Kimura Tsubasa. Ken silently picked up the photograph of this partner and his brother. Daisuke had taken this long ago when he found out about all the horrible things he had gone through at home. After that day, Daisuke had given it to him as a gift before he had been taken away from his father, hoping it would comfort him and remind him that he was never alone. Ken gently ran his fingers through their features, silently wondering if the 2 Digimon missed him. And as he thought that, Ken knew they did. There would be many times where he could feel Stingmon next to him. He could sometimes hear a faint voice, helping him as he went through several of his panic attacks throughout the years. He was sure Stingmon could feel his distress, despite being a whole other world away, and was able to use their bond to reach him. Ken closed his eyes with a sigh as he hugged the photograph. He missed his partner dearly, more so now than ever, and genuinely felt guilty for not thinking about him, nor the others, sooner. "Hey buddy, you okay in there?" Ken guiltily opened his eyes as he heard a knock on the door before his brother poked his head through the half-open door. Ken had felt different things this morning when he woke up. He felt livelier, so much more hopeful, and so much more energetic. It had been something he had not felt in a long, long time. Yeah. Ken vaguely wondered why his head was so much clearer. For once, he actually wanted to smile, to laugh, to scream of pure joy. He wanted to open up his desk drawer, pull out his D-terminal, open it up, and email all his friends for the first time in years. Forget the D-terminal. He wanted to call them, laugh with them, joke with them. "I'm okay, Oni-san." There were so many things he wanted to do. So many things that fear and depression had held him back from. "You sure?" Takumi asked as he took a seat next to him. "You've been in your room all morning. Sanya-san was worried you were having another panic attack when you didn't come out for lunch." Ken looked at his hands guiltily. To be honest, he really hadn't heard her. He hadn't realized he had been thinking for so long. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you and Mama," Ken mumbled softly. "I just had a lot on my mind." Takumi gently poked the side of his temple lightly. "Saito-san said you had to write those thoughts into that journal of yours." Ken pulled his knees close to his body so he could hug them once again. "I know," Ken mumbled, less audibly this time. On their second meeting, his therapist had pointed out right away that he kept too much inside. Ken was more than positive Daisuke would have agreed with the female therapists on her assessment of him. She had gently, yet bluntly, pointed out that it was not healthy for him, nor for his recovery. So she had recommended that he write all his thoughts down. No one would see, no one would read it. But it served as an outlet for him to let out his emotions. Ken had to admit it did help him. There would be days where he felt so afraid that he would write everything, from his father one day coming after him, to his days as the Kaiser. Though his fears of rejection, abuse, and abandonment were more evident in the 12 leather-bound journals than his guilt of his Kaiser days. Recently, however, Ken had begun writing about his friends, his partner, Wormmon, and Felismon, and how much he missed them. That had been this morning, and he had been in his room going over the several letters and emails that Takumi had personally printed out for him, that the others had sent to him over the years. The thick binder laid on his desk opened to one of the letters Daisuke had written to him last year. In the letter, Daisuke had been expressing his dislike that Takaru and Hikari were pretending they didn't like each other, even though it was so obvious they liked each other. Although, that could have been because she had rejected him when Daisuke asked her out a week before the letter was dated on the letter. And? His adoptive brother asked as his eyes drifted to the open binder that Ken was staring blankly at. He blinked before returning his attention to him. "You've been reading through it." His brother didn't form it as a question, but Ken knew what he was asking. His brother had created that binder for him so that one day, when he was ready to read them, there they were. Ken nodded. "Yeah, I felt different this morning. I started thinking about the others a lot, and Wormmon and his brother." Ken rested his chin on his knees. "I began to wonder, why? Why haven't I stayed in contact with them? Why have I been avoiding them all this time? Certainly all they wanted to do was help me." Takumi remained silent as Ken talked, rubbing his back as he silently listened to his brother. If Ken hadn't been so deep in his thoughts, he probably would have noticed a figure, or two, or three, near the door, as well as his brother mouthing something toward the partially half-open door. "This is great news," his brother said, pulling him closer to his body. Ken turned his gaze towards his brother in confusion. "What do you mean, this is great news? I didn't even think about them once, too caught up in my own pain to realize what was going on." Ken's voice rose a bit as it shook with suppressed tears. "I'm a horrible, horrible friend. I don't deserve them." "That's not true, Ken." There was a new voice, a familiar voice. It sounded like... "Daisuke?" came a female voice from outside his door. "Ow!" Ken blinked his eyes to clear his blurry vision. "So much for a surprise," a younger voice said just as Ken turned his gaze toward the door. Ken gasped as he caught sight of who was outside his bedroom door. Smiling sheepishly as he rubbed his head was his best friend, Moromiya Daisuke, with an annoyed Inoue Miyako and a sighing Hida Lori. "Daisuke-kun? Miyako-kun? Lori-kun?" The three walked into the room with birthday presents clearly seen in their hands. Ken then turned to his brother. "How? What?" It was Takumi's turn to look sheepish. Takumi rubbed the back of his neck with his hand. "Well, you see, you've been doing so well over the last couple of months, and this is not just from the therapy sessions, but I could see it too. I could see that you were slowly getting past the nightmares and the fear. You're not getting as many panic attacks, and you're not as withdrawn as you used to be." Ken nodded as he listened. His brother was right. He had been getting better, he guessed. He was thinking more clearly now. The fog of fear and depression was not constantly on his mind. He was sleeping more at night than waking up from bad dreams. He was now able to tell when he was about to get a panic attack, and sometimes he'd be able to push it down before it slammed into him. And the panic attacks didn't come very often. Takumi hugged his brother a little bit more as Daisuke placed his present on Ken's desk before taking a seat next to him. "We understand, Ken. You've been through so much. So much so that I wish I could have helped you." "Not just him," Miyako said with a watery smile. "We all wanted to help. It hurt when you were taken away from us. We feared we would never see you again.
It didn't help that you were so mentally unstable and so out of our reach, either.
Ken flinched slightly at that.
But we are glad you have finally come back to us,
Lori said with a smile that was just as watery. Whether you knew it or not, you needed your friends, Takumi said with a smile. I know you told me you didn't want anything for your birthday. You never do. But I figured that more than anything, you needed your friends. So I thought I would surprise you. Takumi looked over at the other 3 chosen before saying, lamely, Surprise! Takumi's smile was big and wide, but it did seem nervous when Ken didn't say anything and just stood still, clutching the small photograph of his Digimon in his hands as his eyes slowly shifted from him to his friends to back to him. Maybe this was a bad idea, Takumi said, not liking the reaction he was getting, or the lack of one.
Ken, are you okay?
Daisuke gently placed a hand on Ken's shoulder, concern evident on his features, and only pulled back when Ken began to cry, throwing his arms around his brother's shoulder.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Ken sobbed into his brother's shirt as his brother returned the hug. You're welcome. The 2 of them probably would have stayed like that forever if Takumi's cell phone hadn't rung at that moment. Takumi pulled back enough for him to get his cell phone and glance at the screen. Sorry, buddy, I have to take this.
To talk to Nii-chan, perhaps?
Daisuke snickered next to them. Takumi chose to ignore the comment as he released Ken from the hug, leaving him with his friends as he took the call in the hall. Oni-san and Moromiya-chan? Who would have thought? Before Ken could ponder any more on those thoughts, Daisuke threw his arms around him, pulling him into a huge hug.
I missed you so much, dude. Life's not the same without you.
I missed you guys too. Ken returned the hug, smiling through his tears as Lori and Miyako abandoned their presents to join in on the hug. We missed you so much, Miyako said next. But don't you dare think for a minute that we could ever hate you just because you haven't stayed in contact with us within the last 3 years.
She's right,
Lori said next.
We understand that we weren't the first thing that popped into your mind when you were going through your panic attacks and other issues. We are grateful that Kanbara-san kept us updated on your condition every day, though. It really did help us stay hopeful throughout the years. We knew you would come back to us. We just had to wait.
Ken wiped his face with his sleeve as the 4 of them stayed like that, hugging each other, comforting each other for all the time they had lost, and for the pain Ken had to go through. This truly had been the best birthday ever. If only Wormmon was here. As they pulled away, Ken noticed that there were 5 gifts. Hikari-chan and Takaru wanted us to tell you that they're sorry for not being able to come, Miyako said, who frowned slightly. They missed you too, even if they seem to have moved on to other things. Ken frowned. Were the others not as close anymore? Were they distant? Is everything okay back at home? Ken asked them, noticing the way the others were looking at each other. Kinda, Miyako replied. Hikari-chan and Takaru-kun are dating now.
But we don't see them as much anymore,
Lori said with a sigh.
A lot has changed since you've left, Ken-kun,
Daisuke said as he stretched his arms above his head. There was something more going on between their friends, but it seemed they didn't want to talk about it.
But enough about us. You got presents to open.
Ken chuckled at Daisuke's enthusiasm and watched as his best friend gathered all the presents and placed them on the bed. First things first, Miyako interrupted. Taichi-kun request.
Oh, right,
Daisuke said, slightly disappointed when Miyako took one of the gifts out of his hands.
Taichi-senpai was hoping you would want to attend his game tomorrow.
Ken smiled as he gently took the gift from Miyako's hands. I'd love to. Just as he said those words, their digivices began going off. Ken blinked as he glanced at his D3 that he had clipped to his belt. The D3 was vibrating, giving off an odd, familiar heat. Wormmon?
What's going on?
Lori asked, puzzled.
Ken-kun, look, your computer.
Ken blinked as Miyako pointed to his computer, which had awoken from its sleeping state. An odd code was displayed on the screen. Trinary code, if he was guessing right. What in the world? The computer screen glowed brightly. The four of them hadn't known what to expect as they felt a familiar pulling sensation. Though it did catch them all by surprise. Their screams had caused his brother, his parents, Tsubasa, and even Daisuke's half-sister, who had been waiting in the living room, wanting to give the four friends some time alone, to run to their aid. The last thing Ken saw before being pulled through a digital gate was the fear written on his brother's features. Ken!